Hi. I complained about my platoon sergeant, and in return, he put me in charge of the monthly urine tests for the unit. But I had my upside too. About 15 years ago, I was in the Army and had, shall we say, a very specialized skill set. There were a few other guys in our unit with the same skill set. For some strange reason, all the hot girls in their 20s and 20s were assigned Monday through Thursday shifts and had Friday, Saturday, and Sunday off. And guys like me, even though I outranked some of these girls and had more years of service, were assigned the night shift Thursday through Monday. The worst part was that our commander and platoon sergeant were both Monday through Friday and weren't going to give us the time off we were supposed to get during their work hours. This meant that quarterly training sessions like the sexual harassment presentation were usually held on my day off, in the middle of my sleep. Considering that I worked 16-hour shifts and the commute from home to base took an hour, I was constantly suffering from lack of sleep. Even if I finished my shift on time and went straight home, at best I could sleep for 6 hours a day, taking into account the commute, food, and shower. This went on for years despite my protests. I lived in this rhythm for almost 2 years, not having a single day off together with my wife, who worked during the day. Interestingly, the Army even conducted a study that showed that after about 18 hours of wakefulness, a person makes as many stupid and careless mistakes as if he were drunk. Alas, no one told my platoon sergeant, also known as the boss, about this. He decided that lack of sleep was not important. At some point, when I moved from the junior staff, technically I was a specialist, but if you are not familiar with the Army ranks, I consider it just a private to a sergeant. My platoon sergeant decided it was time for me to take over as a sergeant. Sounds logical. We had a target practice day. Once a year, we had to prove our qualifications with the M16 rifle, and we needed a driver to transport the soldiers back and forth from the barracks. I was voluntarily unpaid, I must say. I was working under contract for an agency at the time, and I needed to apply for an exemption from the operation so I wouldn't have to go to work. The thing is, I was temporarily assigned to an agency at the time, and I needed to apply for an exemption from operational work. I was denied, due to a staffing shortage. There was no one at the time who could perform my specific duties. I informed my platoon sergeant about this, to which he replied that the request was just a formality. I was going to the target practice anyway, and it would only take 8 to 10 hours. But, Sergeant, I tried to explain, I would work 16 hours straight before getting behind the wheel, then another 14 straight hours after that. Plus, I'd have to drive soldiers on winding roads I didn't know in a truck, bigger than any vehicle I'd ever driven, and I'd be half asleep. And at the end of that 40-hour shift, I'd still have a half-hour drive home. Is that safe? It is. You think soldiers in Iraq are safe now? Remember, that was about 15 years ago. But no, at least they get risk pay. A specialist is available. Well, what could I do? I've only fallen asleep at the wheel twice, and both times it was at a stoplight. I'd warned all the passengers in advance about my condition, because I was already drowsy when I got there. So the soldiers chatted with me, brought me coffee, and did everything they could to reduce their chances of dying in that truck. About hour 38 into that 40-hour shift, a big shot stalked by my post to check on something. I was literally leaning against the partition, eyes closed, practically asleep. There were 4 empty giant glasses of coffee on the table. Traditionally, there was a sergeant with this VIP officer. They took me apart in a way I had never heard before. Front to back, sides to sides, top to bottom, and even in dimensions I had never even imagined. According to regulations, it is the sergeant accompanying the officer who takes the dressing down. He threatened to file a case against me for negligence. It all ended with the phrase, "Now explain to me, specialist, why the hell did you decide that it was okay to sleep on duty?" I explained to him that I was literally in a semi-conscious state, that I had poured so much coffee into myself that my heart had started to skip beats and I decided to stop. And that it was the 38th hour of my shift and I was just at the limit. I can't tell you how interested important people were in what I was doing. Very important people. At this point, the officer intervened. "You've been working nonstop for 38 hours already?" she asked. I had to explain to her how during my legal sleep time, I was forced to drive people around in a truck. Meanwhile, this agency I was temporarily working for informed my unit that I was irreplaceable. But the chain of command still decided that I, the guy with the skills who was already on shift, should be the duty driver that day. I added that this happened quite often. I couldn't even remember the last time I had a whole week when I was allowed to sleep peacefully at the required time without any idiotic distractions. The amount of stupid I had to do instead of sleeping was simply beyond comprehension. Who is your commander? I tried not to smile and told her, continue serving, specialist. Of course, by lunchtime, which in my case was sleep time, I got a call telling me to report to my platoon sergeant immediately. I sighed. To say I was sleepy would be an understatement. I got home around 8 a.m. and had to go back to work at 4 p.m. The drive back to base alone took an hour. Plus, I had to get dressed, look presentable, listen to their, then get undressed again, then get dressed again, and drive back. Can you explain to me why the sergeant major just read me for the internal schedule for the unit? I told him what happened. You said so. I had to lie to the mission commander about my readiness level. Sergeant, he turned red like Santa Claus, not berserk. No rage at all. Well, not a drop at all. I politely took a step back. In front of me was 6'3" and 250 pounds of sergeant muscle. And I felt like I was taking up too much of his oxygen. Out I went. The orders came from up above. From now on, our unit will have 2 days of quarterly training. No more waking up shift workers once or twice a week because of some administrative. Period. Everyone has been notified that our soldiers will be training on one or the other of those 2 days. Their choice. Happy ending, huh? Yeah, right. This is the Army. Things never end well when you screw over your superiors. What is the most disgusting and stupid job you can give a guy in a strategic unit in the rear? That's right, the urine test guy. For those of you who don't know, his job is to organize and conduct urine tests. This literally means looking at your coworker's junk, because there are a lot of sneaky ways to cheat the test. But trust me, it's disgusting. Luckily, there was a loophole. You see, the brass knows about the nepotism that sometimes occurs in the Army, and it's vitally important that the soldier with grenade launcher not be high. So, under the rules then in effect, and perhaps still in effect, if the urine test supervisor orders a test, only a colonel can cancel it. That's one rung below a general, that's right. If the urine test supervisor decides it's time for the monthly test, be kind enough to wake up, put on your uniform, show up wherever you're told, and woe betide you if your test results show alcohol or anything else. A fellow soldier of mine once got his ass kicked for alcohol on one of these tests. It was his day off because he was working the night shift, and the test was done during work hours for the diaries, but off shift for us. I had about a year left in my service. I wasn't going to renew my contract, and my unit had already gotten its ass kicked by evil people for what they did to me. Let's go. Time for malicious subordination. Imagine it's 11 p.m. on a Friday night, the start of a long weekend. Long for them, but not for me. Because shift workers didn't get holidays unless they took time off, and I needed my days off for family, like Thanksgiving and Christmas. Otherwise, I wouldn't have had a holiday at all. After all, the mission comes first, right? Anyone who's watched Army movies knows that soldiers like to drink, and anyone who's ever taken a urine sample knows that alcohol shows up in there. And being a urine supervisor is a serious job. You're following orders. Everything goes into the Army database. And between the time I officially started the unscheduled inspection process and the time they were supposed to show up at 3 a.m. on their legal weekend. After all, they were the ones who made the rules that soldiers don't get days off when we were complaining about lack of sleep. My order just disappeared. I still don't know how they did it. I suspect that our commander or other big shots were partying and suddenly realized. Now they would have to explain to the colonel why half the unit would fail the test. And that meant a mandatory conversation with the colonel personally about why I chose this particular time, and possibly uncomfortable questions about the methods of managing the unit. In short, for the rest of my service, I was not given a single assignment. All my vacations were automatically approved, and they simply began to avoid me. At the time, I thought that I had simply let them know that I was tired of their lawlessness. Well, now I wonder who exactly and what that unscheduled inspection could have revealed if they were able to cancel my order, issued through the Army system, in a few hours, and at night, to boot. And now the next story. The boss demanded that 100% of vehicle damage be reported, so I approached his order with all due diligence. Previously, I worked as a security supervisor at a large industrial facility. I had a good relationship with the manager, let's call him Dave, until he appointed my buddy as the interim manager, let's call him Steve, between the supervisors and himself. Things didn't go well with Steve from the start, and soon Dave was outright dismissing any ideas, suggestions, or requests I had. The nice guy the first used to be able to sit down and chat with became cold, and sometimes downright hostile towards me. The entire staff noticed this and often said they didn't understand what I had done to upset Dave and Steve, but it was obvious that they were hounding me. To be honest, they were picking on everything. Everything I did or didn't do turned into a long back and forth with Dave and Steve. There's a lot more I could tell, but for the sake of brevity, I'll cut to the chase. The area we patrolled was about 13 square kilometers, so we had company cars to move around the site efficiently and transport equipment and staff. At the start of each shift, one of my duties was to check the vehicles for any damage from the previous shift and to make sure they had everything they needed. The first patrol left immediately after the shift began, which was a mandatory requirement according to the regulations. Patrols could not be delayed, much less missed. It was a night shift, which meant pitch black darkness everywhere. We had good brand lights, but after 6 years of use, they were in less than perfect condition. I found no new damage to the vehicles, recorded everything as normal, and wrote down the mileage on the checklist. The next night, when I showed up for my shift, I had an angry email from Dave demanding to know why my team had damaged one of the vehicles the night before. Allegedly, the car looked like it had crashed backwards into a wall. I went straight to inspect it and found 2 tiny dents in the rear bumper. I found them by touch, not by sight. In the light we had, it was impossible to see them. I questioned my crew, and they all said they had never even been in the car. I checked the checklist, and sure enough, the day shift mileage was the same as the night shift mileage. The car had not moved. I sent Dave a letter saying that the vehicle was not used by our shift and apologizing for not noticing the damage. But that was extremely difficult to do in that light. It was my last shift before the scheduled outings, and I was sure that Steve would have said Dave on to punish me for something during that time. Sure enough, on my first day back from the weekend, I was called into Dave's office for a dressing down. Dave assured me that he could see the damage perfectly well in the dark and could spot it from 30 feet away. To help them understand, I showed the damage to all my guys, and every single one of them, without exception, told me where it was when I pointed it out up close. What's more, there was supposedly another piece of damage that I hadn't noticed, and that my crew was now responsible for as well. Luckily, the boss included a photo of the same damage that had been missed. See the slight scratch? Neither did I, but for Dave and Steve, that was more than to punish me and my crew. And they said that if the culprit wasn't found, I would be personally held responsible and would have to pay for the repairs. Dave also insisted that there was more than enough light to spot any damage to the car. I told him that was absurd and that he couldn't hold me financially responsible for a car that our shift hadn't even used. But Dave was adamant. It was my job to report 100% of all damage to the cars, or I would be at fault. And then something clicked. Luckily, Dave put his demand in writing and mailed it with a copy to Steve. On the next shift, I refused to allow the crew to access the vehicles until each one had been fully inspected inside, out, underneath, and outfitted. This took about 2 hours per vehicle. I took pictures of every little thing, every scratch and dent. It didn't matter how minor it was or if it had been previously recorded. Remember, the order was to record 100% of damage, not 100% of new damage. I emailed Dave with 162 photos and a text description of the nature and location of each defect. The first patrol couldn't be missed, so I had to send one of the guards out on foot. It took him almost 3 hours to do this, and he was no longer able to perform any other duties after that. It's worth noting that my team also took this as a personal attack on themselves, not just me. So they were fully supportive of my actions. Eventually, the shift manager on site demanded an explanation. I told him about Dave's order and why I was forced to send the guards out on foot. I have a great relationship with all the shift managers on site, so although he was annoyed, he understood the impasse I had been forced into, especially after I showed him the printed order. The security company ended up getting a fine. The next day, Dave was off work, so I did the same thing again. Conducted a full inspection and took the same number of photos again, this time from the new inspection. The next night shift, I came to work to find Dave already waiting for me in the office. I was allowed to finish the shift handover with the previous supervisor, and then Dave closed the door and said he would not let me out until we discussed why he had received a bunch of emails. Over 800 megabytes in total. Of course, I did not compress or reduce the photos, and why did the company get a fine, and now the regulatory agency was going to talk to him? I reminded him that he himself required me to report all vehicle damage, and that takes time. I couldn't have anyone on the team use the machine until I'd done a full inspection. Dave was annoyed and said that most of the photos were too dark to show anything and were useless. I apologized for the lighting, but reminded him that he had said there was enough light to see any damage, so he should have seen everything I had recorded. Dave said I had misinterpreted his instructions on purpose, and that there would be disciplinary action. I said no problem, as long as he gave me a date and time, and I would notify my union representative who was aware of the situation and was 100% on my side to report every little detail, every crack on the machines. Dave was left with no options. He abandoned any attempt at disciplinary action and handed over the responsibility of taking care of me to Steve. Steve acted as the punisher for the next 3 months until I left the job. However, every time he tried to undermine me, I easily put it down thanks to briefings with the union representative. I quit in February 2019, and I still get emails from employees who are still there complaining about how terrible work has become because of Dave and Steve. Comments, petty idiots. They will eventually cost the company more than they are worth, and they will be fired. Author. I really wish that were the case, but this company has a long and storied history of terrible management. From what I understand, Dave now manages security for several facilities, not just this one. By the way, I should mention that he has a bad habit of only hiring his friends. Story number 3. An airport security guard picked on my nail scissors, but I could have brought a gun and 45 rounds of ammunition on board without any problem. I used to work for the Federal Bureau of Prisons, FBOP. I worked at a large complex that had 4 types of facilities for different categories of prisoners: camp, medium, maximum security, and supermax. I was on the transport team, which was usually busy moving prisoners between prisons for medical exams and such. But sometimes we had to do emergency transports, like to the hospital or, like in this case, moving under the Witness Protection Program, WPS. These guys usually testified against big bosses in exchange for a lighter sentence. So, if any of the prisoners recognized them, they had to be moved urgently. Everyone on the transport team had an emergency backpack that was kept in a locker. I was new, so I just bought the bare necessities: a change of underwear, soft pants, a t-shirt, and the standard toiletries from the supermarket. So I show up for work, go to my unit, and suddenly a lieutenant intercepts me. Someone really screwed up. We had a witness from the protection program and his former partner, whom he snitched on in the same prison. The witness was already in the detention center, and we were sent to transport him to Florida. The plane took off in a couple of hours. The driver was already ready. The prisoner's belongings will be sent by mail. Why such urgency? Because they are both maximum security prisoners with a very high rating for escape risk and threat to society. Plus, both are connected to gangsters. In short, if one found out that the other was in the same prison, it could end in a full-fledged riot. If memory serves, 3 of us lost our jobs for this blunder. We grab our alarm backpacks, fill out the paperwork, and go to the armory. This prisoner had to be transported in 5-point cuffs with at least 2 armed guards. We were given 9mm pistols and 45 rounds of ammunition each. We had 3 magazines, 2 on the belt holster, 1 in the pistol, and 1 round in the chamber. Before leaving the armory, we had to count every round. My partner and I get all the documents in triplicate, pick up the prisoner, and off we go. We arrive at the Denver airport, and there's a whole special check-in procedure. One of the rules, they give you a red card along with your boarding pass so that the airport security staff knows that you're from law enforcement and that you have a weapon with you. Let me remind you, this was a long time ago, and this whole system was still new, so we have to get the shackled prisoner through security. We're a little freaked out by this, but we're like, okay, and we start moving our guy forward. When we showed the ticket inspector at the gate, the one who only lets people in with boarding passes, our tickets and red cards, he sent us to a separate security line. There we locked the prisoner in a special room. Security checked the number of rounds, made sure the gun was loaded and all that. A bunch of paperwork. The number of rounds will have to be confirmed upon arrival. My partner and I finish all the formalities, sign the papers, and then the security officer says, "I need to scan your bags too." We shrug our shoulders, throw them on the belt. The belt hums, the screen lights up, and then the officer stops the belt and peers at the monitor. Finally, she says, "Open your bag." I look at her questioningly, but open it. She points to my makeup bag and says, "Open this." Since I've never opened it before, I had to open the package. I dump the contents out, and then she triumphantly exclaims, "Aha!" and grabs a tiny pair of nail scissors about 2.5 centimeters long. Seriously, they were the smallest scissors I've ever seen in my life. She looks at me triumphantly and with the smug face of a seasoned airport Cerberus declares, "This is a prohibited item." I stared at her, truly dumbfounded. For about 30 seconds, I just stood there silently, then blinked a couple of times and calmly said, "Okay, keep it." And I started to pack the things back into the bag, but they were right there. Miss wasn't going to give in so easily. With defiant impudence, she declares, "I am not your mother and not your personal assistant. You brought a prohibited item here, so take it. And where should I put it? I don't care what you do with it. The main thing is that it is not here. If you really think that these scissors pose a threat to the safety of the flight, then just keep them. We do not have time to run outside with them. This is not my problem. You should have thought earlier when you decided to bring prohibited items on my plane. You understand that literally a few minutes ago we counted 45 rounds of ammunition. Well, but in a pinch, given all the means available to me, the last thing I would use to hijack the plane would be these deadly scissors. If they really were left as my only option, I would simply cancel the entire operation. By the way, my partner was already falling over laughing at this point, as soon as he realized that she was absolutely serious. He thinks he is laughing quietly, but believe me, you can hear him choking on the X-ray tape. I don't know what to tell you, but I'm not going to throw them away for you, and I'm certainly not letting you on my plane with them. Ma'am, let's look at the situation logically. We have a flight to board, and no one is boarding until we load our prisoner. I'm a federal officer. My partner and I don't want any attention for your safety. I have a pistol and 45 rounds of ammunition. If I can be trusted with a gun, can I not be trusted with a pair of scissors? I promise to throw them away when we land. I don't know who you think you're talking to. I said, take them and get out of here. She did it like she was throwing down the microphone, said her signature line, stepped back, crossed her arms, and stared at me. I just started laughing at the absurdity of the situation. I grabbed the scissors, put them in my front pocket, and tell my partner, let's go. We go back for the prisoner and lead him forward. My partner is already on the phone with the lieutenant and captain telling them what's going on. They're in shock and furious. We're called to Gate X to board. I step out of this employee's line of sight and go to another one. I ask her to call the supervisor because we have an important matter and show her my red card. She calls the supervisor with some code that says, "Get the hell out of here right now," because a few seconds later he's running up to us. I politely ask him to call Gate X Race Y and let me know there will be a delay of about an hour because I can't dispose of the prohibited scissors within the airport. He looks at me like a puppy who just heard a strange whistle, head tilted, studying my weapon. I explain, I'm sorry, I didn't know I had nail scissors in my kit. Your employee made it very clear that there are no exceptions, and I'm obligated to take them out outside the terminal before we can board the plane. Unless you could help us not to lead this guy? Nodding at the prisoner back through the airport, taking the scissors out of my pocket and handing them to him. Anyway, let's recap. The supervisor took the scissors, promised to look into it, gave us a ride on the car to the gate, and we boarded the plane. The rest of the flight was uneventful, except for the endless hilarious jokes from my partner. He told this story to everyone. Even the warden called us into his office to hear it firsthand. In the end, everyone was laughing, except for that employee, of course. Federal prison. Fun every minute. Well, that's all the stories for today. Write in which one you liked the most. Also, if you work in a similar profession, you can share your story or maybe some comments on these stories that you saw here. Maybe you have something to add. Anyway, thanks for watching this video to the end. Watch our previous videos, which you will see here. And good luck to you.